My name is Jessica Reynolds. I am 26 years old and I live in Seattle. For 4 years, I had treated my marriage as a partnership built on shared goals and quiet compromises. I kept my head down at my job in a downtown tech firm, brought in steady raises, and told myself that the small withdrawals from our joint account were just Matthew being practical about our future. My best friend Ashley Bennett had been in my life since college. She always nodded when Matthew spoke about stability and said he was the steady one I needed. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in my office when I opened an old external drive I had not touched since before the wedding. I was looking for an archived client file. Instead, a voice memo from 3 years earlier started playing through my headphones. Matthew's voice came first low and calm. Ashley answered him. They were talking about me. She gets these ideas about keeping things separate, Matthew said on the recording. If we let her keep her own accounts, she will just spend on whatever she wants. We need to move things over gradually so she does not notice. Ashley laughed softly. She trusts you. Just keep telling her it is for both of you. She will sign whatever you put in front of her if you frame it as protecting her from herself. I listened to the full 3 minutes without pausing. Then I listened again. My hand stayed steady on the keyboard. I noted the date stamp on the file, saved a copy to a new folder I labeled only with numbers, and closed the drive. No one in the open office around me knew anything had shifted. I finished the client report I had been working on and sent it before 5. When I got home that evening, Matthew was already in the kitchen. He asked how my day had gone in the same even tone he always used. I told him it had been ordinary. He nodded and mentioned that Ashley was coming over on Friday because she wanted to talk about a group investment she had found. He said it would be smart for all 3 of us to put some of my recent bonus into it. He called it our money without looking up from his phone. I did not argue. I asked what kind of investment it was. He said Ashley would explain everything when she arrived. I said that sounded fine and went to change out of my work clothes. In the bedroom, I opened the notes app on my phone and typed the date, the time, and the exact words he had used about the bonus. I added the file name of the old recording and the folder location. Then I put the phone away and came back to the kitchen. Over dinner, he brought up the bonus again. He said it made sense to move it soon because the opportunity would not wait. I asked if he had already looked at the paperwork. He said Ashley had the forms ready and that I could sign them on Friday after she explained the numbers. His voice stayed patient the way it always did when he explained money to me. I told him I would read everything first. He smiled and said, of course, but that I should not overthink it, the way I sometimes did with work decisions. I slept that night without trouble. In the morning, I called Dr. Laura Simmons, the therapist I had started seeing 6 months earlier, when Matthew suggested it might help with what he called my occasional anxiety about decisions. I told her office I needed an earlier appointment than the one already scheduled. They fit me in for Thursday afternoon. On Wednesday at work, I pulled the financial statements for the joint account going back 2 years. I highlighted every transfer Matthew had initiated without telling me first. Most were small. Together they added up to more than I had realized. I made a second copy of the statements and left them on a USB drive in my desk drawer at the office. I did not take them home. Thursday after work, I sat in Dr. Laura Simmons's office and told her I had found an old recording of my husband and my best friend discussing how to move my money without my full understanding. I played the memo for her from my phone. She listened without interrupting. When it ended, she asked what I planned to do next. I said I was going to keep records of every conversation about money from now on. She asked if I felt safe continuing to live in the apartment. I said the situation had not reached that point yet. She nodded and scheduled another appointment for the following week. That evening, Matthew asked if I had thought any more about the investment Ashley was bringing on Friday. I told him I wanted to see the actual documents before deciding anything. He said Ashley would have them and that it was a limited window. His tone did not change, but he repeated the part about it being a good opportunity twice. I said I understood and went to bed early. Friday morning, I received a text from Ashley confirming she would be at the apartment at 7. She added that she was excited for us to all get on the same page about building wealth together. I replied that I would be there. Then I opened the Notes app again and added the exact wording of her message with the date and time. When I came home from work, Matthew had already set the table for 3. He poured a glass of wine for each of us and left the bottle on the counter. Ashley arrived a few minutes after 7 carrying a folder. She hugged me at the door the way she always did and said she was glad we were finally doing this as a team. Matthew pulled out a chair for her and then for me. Ashley opened the folder and spread out several pages. She explained that the investment was in a private real estate fund her cousin managed. The minimum was the exact amount of my most recent bonus plus a small additional transfer from the joint account. She said the returns would cover the down payment on a larger place in 2 years. Matthew nodded along and said it aligned with the timeline we had talked about for starting a family. He looked at me when he said the last part. I picked up the top page and read the fine print. The fund required all investors to keep their money locked for at least 36 months with early withdrawal penalties that started at 20%. I asked what happened if someone needed the money sooner. Ashley said that was why it was important to be sure before signing. Matthew added that I had a habit of changing my mind about big choices and that locking the money would protect me from myself. I set the page down. I told them I needed more time to review the documents and to speak with someone who understood the legal side. Ashley's smile stayed in place, but she glanced at Matthew. He said there was no need to bring in outsiders when Ashley's cousin had already explained everything clearly. I repeated that I wanted to read it carefully first. The conversation stayed calm on the surface. Underneath, I could feel the pressure settle into the room like a change in air pressure before a storm. Matthew refilled my wine glass even though I had not finished the first one. He said we could sign tonight and I could always ask questions later and if anything still felt unclear. Ashley agreed that was the practical approach. I stood up, carried my glass to the sink, and poured the rest down the drain. I told them I was tired from the week and that we could continue the discussion another time. Ashley gathered the papers back into the folder without comment. Matthew walked her to the door and thanked her for coming. After she left, he turned to me in the hallway. He said he was disappointed that I had made Ashley feel unwelcome when she was only trying to help us both. He said I had been difficult about money lately and that it was starting to affect our relationship. His voice remained even. He did not raise it. I told him I was going to bed and that we could talk in the morning if he still wanted to. He did not follow me into the bedroom. I lay awake for a long time listening to the quiet of the apartment. I thought about the recording I had found, the transfers I'd highlighted, and the way both of them had used the same phrases about protecting me from my own choices. I opened the Notes app one more time and typed the date, the time, and a single sentence describing what had just happened at the table. Then I closed the phone and placed it face down on the nightstand. The next morning, Matthew left for work without mentioning the investment again. I waited until he was gone before I called Robert Kline, an attorney whose name I had found through a coworker 2 weeks earlier when I had started wondering whether I needed to understand my legal options around shared accounts. I told his assistant I needed a consultation about marital finances and that I could come in the following week. She scheduled me for Tuesday at 10. I spent the rest of the weekend keeping the same routines I had always kept. I went for a run on Saturday morning. I grocery shopped in the afternoon. Matthew and I ate dinner together and watched a show without talking about the folder Ashley had brought. On Sunday, I cleaned out the hall closet and found an old notebook I had used in the first year of our marriage. I flipped through it without expecting anything in particular. On one of the back pages, I had written a short list of times Matthew had asked me to move money from my personal savings into the joint account and had told me it was temporary. The dates went back almost 3 years. I tore the page out, folded it, and placed it inside the same numbered folder on my work laptop where I kept the recording and the financial statements. Monday at the office, I told my manager I needed to take a personal day on Tuesday for a medical appointment. She approved it without questions. That evening, Matthew asked if I had given any more thought to the real estate fund. I said I had not and that I was still reviewing the documents. He nodded and changed the subject to a project at his own job. I noted the exchange in the app before I went to sleep. On Tuesday morning, I took the bus downtown to Robert Kline's office. I brought the USB drive with the recording the highlighted statements and the torn notebook page. I also brought the text messages from Ashley confirming the Friday meeting. Robert Kline listened while I laid everything out in order. He asked clarifying questions about dates and amounts. When I finished, he told me the recording alone did not constitute legal proof of wrongdoing, but that the pattern of transfers and the coordinated pressure around the investment could matter if I decided to pursue a formal separation of finances. He said he could help me understand my options for protecting what I had earned independently. I told him I wanted to proceed with whatever steps would give me clear records and boundaries going forward. He said he would draft a letter to my husband requesting full disclosure of all joint accounts and any investments made in both names. He scheduled a follow-up for the next week. I left his office and walked 2 blocks to a cafe I had never used before. I sat at a corner table with my back to the wall and opened the Notes app again. I typed the time I had left the attorney's office and the next appointment date. Then I closed the phone and finished my coffee. Outside the window, the rain had started again, the steady kind that Seattle gets in early spring. I watched people pass with umbrellas and thought about how little had actually changed in the 4 years I'd been married. The only difference now was that I'd begun writing things down instead of letting them slide. When I got home that evening, Matthew was already there. He asked how my day had gone. I said it had been fine. He mentioned that Ashley had texted him asking if we had made a decision about the fund. I told him I had not signed anything and that I was still looking at the paperwork. He said Ashley was only trying to be helpful and that I was making the situation more complicated than it needed to be. I did not answer. I went into the bedroom and closed the door. Later that night, after Matthew had gone to sleep, I opened the old notebook again and added one more line at the bottom of the torn page. It was simply the date I had met with Robert Kline and the fact that I had asked him to send the disclosure letter. I folded the page back into the folder on my work laptop and shut the computer down. Then I lay in bed listening to the rain on the windows and waited for morning. The following morning, I left for work before my husband woke up. I checked my email on the bus and saw the confirmation from Robert Kline that the disclosure letter had been sent by certified mail the previous afternoon. The message was short and factual. It listed the accounts I had asked him to include and requested a full accounting within 14 days. I saved the email to the same numbered folder on my work laptop and closed the browser before I reached my stop. At the office, I kept to my usual routine. I answered client questions, updated project timelines, and ate lunch at my desk. Around 2 o'clock, Rachel Morgan stopped by my cubicle with a question about a shared client file. She noticed the extra USB drive I had left on the corner of the desk and asked if I was backing up old work. I told her I was organizing personal records that had been scattered across devices. She nodded and moved on without pressing. I added her name and the time of the exchange to my Notes app that evening. 2 days later, the certified letter arrived at the apartment. My husband brought the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen counter without opening it. He waited until after dinner to mention it. He said the attorney's request was unnecessary and that it would only create confusion between us. He asked why I'd gone to someone outside our marriage instead of talking to him directly. His tone stayed measured, but he repeated the word unnecessary 3 times in the same sentence. I told him I wanted a clear record of every account that carried both our names. He said records already existed and that I was welcome to look at them whenever I wanted. I asked for copies of the statements from the past 36 months. He said he would print them when he had time. I noted the date and his exact phrasing in the app before I went to sleep. The next morning, Ashley Bennett called while I was on my way to work. She asked if everything was all right between Matthew and me. She said he had sounded stressed when she spoke with him the night before. I told her we were discussing finances and that I had asked for documentation. She paused and then said Matthew had always been the one who handled the numbers because I tended to get overwhelmed by details. I thanked her for her concern and ended the call. I added the conversation to the notes with the timestamp and her exact words about me getting overwhelmed. That weekend, my husband suggested we meet with Ashley again to clear the air about the investment. He said the fund opportunity was still open and that the three of us could review the paperwork together in a calmer setting. I said I was not ready to sign anything until I had the account statements I had requested. He said the delay was only making Ashley's cousin hold the spot open longer than he wanted to. I repeated that I needed the statements first. He did not raise his voice, but he told me I was being rigid in a way that was starting to damage the trust in our marriage. I wrote down the sentence and the date. On Monday, I met with David Chen, the financial advisor whose name Robert Kline had given me during the initial consultation. I brought copies of the joint account statements I had already pulled and the highlighted transfers. David Chen reviewed the numbers without comment for several minutes. Then he pointed out 3 transfers that had been labeled as household expenses but matched deposits into an account that carried only my husband's name. The amounts were small individually, but totaled more than $8,000 over 2 years. He asked if I had authorized those specific moves. I said I had not. He made a copy of the statements for his file and said he would prepare a summary I could give to Robert Kline. I scheduled a follow-up for the end of the week. When I got home that evening, my husband was waiting in the living room. He had the disclosure letter open on the coffee table. He asked who David Chen was and why I'd met with him without telling him first. I told him David Chen was helping me understand the account activity. My husband said I was creating problems that did not exist and that I was letting outside people influence decisions that should stay between us. He added that Ashley had noticed I was pulling away from her as well and that it was affecting their friendship too. I told him I was keeping my own records of the conversations we were having. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Recording private discussions was not how a marriage worked." I did not reply. I went into the bedroom and closed the door. Later that night, I opened the old notebook again while he was in the shower. I was looking for the page where I had listed the early transfers. Instead, I found several loose sheets tucked behind the back cover that I had not noticed before. They were written in my own handwriting from the first year of our marriage. One entry described a conversation I had overheard between my husband and Ashley at a restaurant when they thought I had gone to the restroom. Ashley had said something about keeping me from opening a separate account because it would complicate things later. My husband had agreed and said it was easier if I believed the joint account was temporary. The date on the page was 14 months after our wedding. I read the pages twice. The handwriting was mine, but the memory of writing them had disappeared until that moment. I folded the sheets carefully and placed them inside the numbered folder on my work laptop with the rest of the documents. Then I added a new line in the Notes app describing what I had found and the date I had found it. The following day, Ashley sent a group text to both of us. She said she had spoken with her cousin and that the investment window was closing at the end of the week. She asked if we could all sit down one more time before the opportunity disappeared. My husband forwarded the message to me with a note that said we should try to resolve this before it affected other parts of our life. I replied to the group text that I needed the account statements first and that I would not sign anything until I had them. Ashley responded privately to me a few minutes later. She wrote that I was making Matthew feel like he could not trust me anymore, and that she was worried about what that meant for our friendship. I saved the message without answering. On Thursday evening, my husband came home with a new set of papers. He said they were a simple agreement that would move the recent bonus into the joint account so it could be included in the investment without further delay. He placed the papers on the kitchen table and asked me to sign them so we could move forward. I told him I wanted Robert Kline to review them first. He said involving the attorney again would only slow everything down and that the papers were straightforward. I repeated that I wanted the attorney to see them. He picked up the papers, folded them, and put them in his briefcase before he left the room. He said I was choosing to treat him like an adversary instead of a partner, and that he hoped I understood what that choice was doing to us. I waited until he had gone to bed before I called Robert Kline's office and left a message that I had new documents to add to the file. Then I opened the Notes app and recorded the conversation that had just taken place, including the exact words my husband had used about treating him like an adversary. I also noted the time and that the new papers had not been signed. The next morning, I received an email from David Chen with his summary of the account activity. He had flagged 6 additional transfers that did not match any receipts or explanations in the household records. He wrote that the pattern suggested systematic movement of funds out of joint accounts into accounts accessible only to my husband. I forwarded the email to Robert Kline with a note that I wanted to add it to the disclosure request. Then I closed the laptop and went to work. That afternoon, Rachel Morgan asked if everything was all right. She said I had seemed distracted during the team meeting. I told her I was dealing with some personal paperwork and that it was taking more time than I expected. She offered to cover one of my client calls if I needed the afternoon. I thanked her and said I would handle it. After she left my cubicle, I added her offer and the time to the notes. When I got home, my husband and Ashley Bennett were both sitting at the kitchen table. The new papers were spread out again. Ashley said they had come over to talk through everything one last time before the investment window closed. My husband said he had explained to her that I was insisting on involving an attorney and that he wanted her to hear my reasons directly. Ashley looked at me and said she was confused why I suddenly did not trust either of them after all the years we had known each other. My husband added that the papers were simple and that signing them would prove I still believed in our future together. I stood in the doorway and looked at both of them. I told them I would not sign anything until Robert Kline had reviewed the documents and until I had received the full account statements I had requested weeks earlier. Ashley started to speak again, but my husband raised a hand slightly and she stopped. He looked at me and said that if I continued to treat the marriage like a legal negotiation instead of a relationship, there would be consequences I had not considered. His voice remained calm. He did not specify what those consequences were. I walked past them into the bedroom, closed the door, and locked it. I opened the Notes app and typed the date, the time, and the exact words my husband had just used about consequences. Then I called Robert Kline's emergency line and left a message that the pressure to sign had increased and that I wanted to discuss next steps in the morning. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the low voices in the kitchen. They did not sound angry. They sounded like 2 people who had already decided what the next move should be. I opened the work laptop one more time and checked the folder. The old recording, the highlighted statements, the torn notebook page, the diary sheets I had found 2 nights earlier, and David Chen's summary were all there. I added the time of the conversation that had just ended and closed the computer. Then I lay down on top of the covers and waited for morning without turning off the light. The next morning, I met with Robert Kline in his office. I brought the diary pages I had found, David Chen's summary, and the recording I had made on my phone of the conversation from the night before. Robert Kline reviewed everything without comment for several minutes. Then he told me the pattern of unauthorized transfers combined with the coordinated pressure to sign documents could support a request to separate the accounts immediately and to freeze further movement until a full accounting was complete. He asked if I wanted to proceed with filing. I said yes. That afternoon, my husband called while I was still at work. And he said he and Ashley had talked and that they were willing to meet one more time to resolve everything without involving more attorneys. But he suggested the apartment that evening. I told him I would be there at 7 and that Robert Kline would be joining by phone if needed. He paused and then said bringing the attorney into a personal conversation was unnecessary. I repeated the time and ended the call. I added the exchange to the notes app with the exact words he had used. When I arrived home at 6:30, the apartment was quiet. I set up my phone on the kitchen counter to record and place printed copies of the key documents on the table. At 7, my husband and Ashley Bennett arrived together. Ashley carried the same folder she had brought weeks earlier. My husband set his keys on the counter and looked at the papers I had laid out. He asked what this was supposed to be. I told him it was the documentation I had requested and the evidence of the transfers that had moved money out of the joint accounts without my knowledge. Ashley said those transfers had been for household things and that I was twisting normal married life into something suspicious. My husband added that I had always been anxious about money and that this was just another example of me overreacting. I played the recording from the night before. My husband's voice filled the kitchen as he said that continuing to treat the marriage like a legal negotiation would have consequences I had not considered. When it ended, I placed the phone face down and waited. Ashley looked at him and then at the papers. She said the recording did not prove anything except that he had been frustrated. My husband said nothing for a moment, then he told me I was destroying our marriage over nothing, and that Ashley had only ever tried to help us both build something stable. I opened the folder and showed them David Chen's summary. I pointed to the 6 transfers that had gone into accounts only he could access. I showed them the diary pages from the first year of our marriage, where I had written about the conversation I overheard between the two of them. I told them the old voice memo from 3 years earlier was already with Robert Kline. My husband's face stayed still, but Ashley shifted in her chair and said none of it meant what I thought it meant. Robert Kline called at 7:15 as we had arranged. I put the call on speaker. He explained that the combination of the financial summary and the recorded statements created a basis to request immediate separation of assets and a temporary restraining order on further transfers. He said the bank had already been notified of the discrepancies and that an internal review was underway. My husband asked what that meant in practical terms. Robert Kline said it meant the accounts would be frozen pending full disclosure and that any attempt to move funds further would be documented as potential concealment. Ashley stood up. She said this had gone too far and that I was punishing both of them for trying to look out for my future. My husband remained seated. He looked at me and said I had chosen to believe strangers over the person I had married. His voice was still calm, but the words came out slower than usual. I told him I had chosen to believe the records I had kept and the evidence that had surfaced on its own. I said I would not be signing anything and that any further communication should go through Robert Kline. Ashley picked up her folder and walked to the door without looking back. My husband stayed for another minute. He asked if this was really what I wanted. I said it was what I had decided after seeing the full pattern. He stood, took his keys, and left without closing the door behind him. I locked it after he was gone and turned off the recording on my phone. The following week, Robert Kline filed the necessary paperwork. The bank confirmed the freeze on the joint accounts and began its own review of the transfers David Chen had flagged. David Chen later told me that after our first meeting, he had contacted a compliance officer he knew at the bank because the pattern had concerned him enough to warrant an internal flag. That flag had already been active when Robert Kline's disclosure letter arrived. The combination accelerated the review and gave the separation request additional weight. I moved out of the apartment 2 weeks later. Rachel Morgan helped me carry boxes to a small place in the same neighborhood. She did not ask many questions, only whether I needed anything else moved. I told her I was fine and thanked her for the help. Kevin Patel from the office offered to lend me a truck if I needed one for furniture. I declined, but noted both offers in the same folder where I kept everything else. Dr. Laura Simmons and I continued meeting weekly. She asked how I was sleeping and whether the pressure had eased. I told her the legal steps were moving forward and that I had stopped answering calls or texts from my husband or Ashley Bennett. She said maintaining the boundary was the part that often proved hardest. I told her the boundary was the only part that felt clear. 3 months after the accounts were frozen, the bank's review concluded that several transfers had been made without matching authorization or receipts. Robert Kline used that finding to negotiate a clean separation of assets. I kept the full amount of my bonus and the portions of the joint account that could be traced directly to my income. My husband was required to return the unauthorized amounts. The investment opportunity Ashley had brought never moved forward once the accounts were locked. I did not see either of them again after that night in the kitchen. Ashley stopped reaching out to mutual friends once word of the account review spread. My husband sent one final email through Robert Kline asking if there was any room to talk without attorneys. I instructed Robert Kline to reply that all communication should remain through counsel. After that, there was nothing. I kept the numbered folder on my work laptop for another 6 months and then moved its contents to a secure external drive I stored in a safety deposit box. I did not need to look at it often. The records had done what they were meant to do. They had shown the pattern clearly enough that outside parties could see it without me having to explain it repeatedly. In the new apartment, I set up a desk by the window and went back to work on projects that had nothing to do with joint accounts or investment windows. I continued seeing Dr. Laura Simmons. I met with David Chen once more to close out the financial review and thanked him for the summary that had clarified what I had already begun to document on my own. He said he had only put numbers to a pattern that was already visible once someone chose to look. The lesson I took from all of it was simple. Boundaries were not something I owed anyone an explanation for. They were the line I drew when the pattern became clear, and when continuing without them would have meant handing over control I had never agreed to give. Marriage had given my husband legal standing in certain areas, but it had never given him ownership of my decisions or my resources. Once I treated that distinction as fact instead of negotiation, the rest followed without drama and without regret. I still live in Seattle. I still work at the same firm. The joint accounts are gone, and the folder with the recordings and statements stays in the safety deposit box. I answer to no one about how I spend what I earn. That is the only outcome I needed. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever watched someone you trusted try to steer your choices while calling it protection, you already know how quietly it can happen. What would you have done when the old recording first played